Welcome. And this talk is actually 40 minutes, so we'll squeeze it into 30. So here's the deal. Every time I get to Codefin, I'll just count to 3 and I'll move over the slide because I cannot explain, and you've had it from the source explained before, so I won't be spending time on that. I was told this goes on YouTube, so if you're watching this on YouTube and you don't know what Codefin is, then please stop now and just watch an introductory 10 minutes or so on Codefin itself. That should suffice. So Codefin is actually, it's derived from Codefin, but it goes into software engineering. Basically, I applied it to various practices, methods we have in software engineering. So first I'm going to explain that for me it's so relevant because Codefin, when I first met it, it made me realize how important it is to help and guide our decisions. But even more importantly, then I began to realize how many decisions we're not actually consciously making. How many decisions we're just making habitually because we're conditioned. We're used to living in a certain environment, a certain domain, a certain context. And then we just keep on applying those practices. And as things are, we're applying those practices elsewhere without consciously deciding. And sometimes, oftentimes, that doesn't work so well. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you a story about Codefin, my personal story of how I met it before it even existed. Then I'm going to give you a lot of impressions of everywhere I personally can see it, and then we get into Codefin. So the story was, I was studying in like around 90, and I mean, what's the point of studying if you can't go out? So I needed money for clubbing and things. So I took this project. It's called TCOV. It's test coverage. So it was like for C programs, and to sort of modify the program so that you can track it, how fast it runs, what parts get run a lot, what parts we don't get to. So it needed this kind of tools that I was familiar with because we studied compiler design. I'm not sure if any of you knows any of those, but they were like the Stone Age tools we used for compiler buildings. And I said, well, that's going to be great because that's what I studied for. I know this. And several days later, I realized I don't know nothing about compiler design. It's probably some experience many of you possibly, hopefully made at university when you realize whatever you learned is useless. I totally failed. Like I didn't know where to begin building this compiler thing, and I was hating it. And this was like, I was totally like this existential crisis type thing. I was totally lost in it, and I just didn't know where to even. I mean, I was getting all this. And now you know where it's going. This really maps to this disorder state. I was just getting all this conflicting information. I thought I knew some things, but I realized I don't, and I didn't know where to begin and how to get going. So then I called a friend of mine. He was actually dealing with languages, and he came over, brought a floppy disk. Remember, it was 90, no internet. So he brought this GNU thing, a compiler thing that GNU is the open source thing that you also know from Linux, probably. And he wrote this compiler thing and gave it to me and said, you know, you can just build on this and that'll be all fine. And he went away. And several days later, I realized, nope. I was in there, I was trying to get this compiler thing work for me, and I was not studying, I was not clubbing, I was sitting there like freaking out, nothing worked. I tried to make a little change, something else blew up. I tried to make a big change, nothing changed. It's like I didn't know what was going on. It was just no constraints. For me, it was a totally good experience of this chaotic domain. Now, I had to call him back. And so he came in and said, well, I know it's hard because, you know, you just have to come here and remove this bit, but not the top 10 lines, just down from here, you take it out, and that part, you set it this way, and then it's like, and then things began to come together because we introduced these constraints, things not to touch, things to take out, and then so we reduced it to a scope that we could work with, that I could begin working with. So we had this kind of hello world type of thing already. And from then on, I could go on And basically what I had to do is, from this hello world, that's like the expression for this 4-line of kind of program, I had to gradually build everything into it. And it was like these small experiments I had to be making, like, I wonder, I'm making this change, does it work? No, it doesn't. So I had to make this experience, and as I progressed, it sort of began to come together, and I begin to understand how this compiler design will work. I've basically eliminated the unknowns that I still had. That was the complex domain for you. And after I had these unknowns gone, I actually could breathe, because I realized now I can get stuff done. It wasn't easy because CPU was expensive, memory was scarce, so I had to optimize everything down to the last bit. But I had books for that. That's what you really had. There was literature. I could grab my ACM papers. I could bring all the knowledge in that I've built on, and I could make this work, and I could begin sort of drawing architectures and begin implementing all these structures. And that felt good. I thought that's what software development is about. Turns out, not all of it. And that was my experience of the complicated domain back in '90, when the constraints were in place for me to sort of get ahead, building on the knowledge. And then I was like, I thought I'd be gone. And then there's Mr. Pareto, this Italian gentleman, he sort of had this sort of principle, and kind of, I was talking to him, and then he was going, well, young man, what you doing? I said, I'm in this project. And I said, I'm almost done. Are you really? I think I'm 80% done, I said to him. And he looked at me and said, I think it's the other way around. And I said, yeah, idiot. But the thing is, it turns out it was right. Because I had this to-do list left, like 4 items, like just do this, this, this. Now that thing grew over like 2 pages. It was like add options, clean up the presentation, add whatever, documentation, help screens, whatever. Tedious work, and plenty of it. And I was hating this project again. So I was like, somebody kill me now, get this over with. And there was this obvious domain. I mean, it had to be done. But every one of it was kind of really strictly sort of constrained. And moving over, not explaining more how it mapped to the obvious domain. But this was my experience in the '90s, when then I later was beginning to read Mr. Snowden's blog. And I remember one of his blog post that you should be probably following too. I would really recommend it. And one of his blog posts where he was trekking in the mountains of Wales. He ended it in the mountains, as with most things. Context is everything, and it indeed is. I just had this project. I didn't know nothing. And if you think about it, within a few weeks, I've experienced all these different contexts, all these different domains, where everything I had to do was based on a very different kind of like practice. And so I give you now these screens where I'll be going to count to 3, and you recognize them all. And that's the dragon in the backdrop. That was the Welsh dragon. This screen you will recognize. So just go 1, 2, 3. That thing you recognize, that's the complacency, when some beasts are gonna eat you if you fall asleep. And what I do in Codefin is I do away with the lines, because I consider this very fluid kind of affair. I think we're moving most of the time. We're somewhere, but we're heading another way, kind of back and forth. There's a lot of changes and dynamic during this. So I'll be using this kind of like compass kind of metaphor, and that's another way of presenting Codefin for you. And again, I'm not going to explain a lot. I mean, in a chaotic end, it's just like you think you can grab it here, and then it gets you from the back. You think it's squishy, and it bites your finger off, so it's like no logic. The other end, you think you're safe and cozy and things, and then the water pulls back, and then you go, oops, no legs. So this is just another presentation of it. Now, And then once I began to realize how powerful Codefin is, then I began to see it everywhere. And these few slides I'll be powering through. This is not meant to explain anything. This is really just to give you an impression that maybe, hopefully, it will resonate with some of you. Because once you see it everywhere. So what happens is that in terms of knowledge, Donald Rumsfeld, unknown unknowns, it's actually a very good term. That's how this maps. Then in terms of what you do, how you go at it, you have to discover, invent, and apply knowledge, and then institutionalize or comply to established norms. Then in terms of product maturity, you don't have much of a product to speak of. In chaotic, you have custom solutions versus products and commodities. Then team dynamic, any of you running teams, probably many, right? You know all this thing. I mean, and the thing is, this is a good indication how multitude, I mean, you're never in one domain. Like your infrastructure may be obvious. Your technology stack may be kind of complicated, but under control. And then your business may be throwing stuff at you they don't even know they're talking about. So you're kind of complex. And then they send another sort of architect into the team that's totally head-on with the other one you already have. And then you have a forming stage back again. So it's always changing, and there's always a multitude. Moving on. In terms of team organization, you really need a very quick response and a very flexible response in chaotic. And yes, you can get away with a controlled amount of bureaucracy. This mindset thing is important. I don't know if you know this. There's a psychological profiles. You can sort of Google for them and sort of apply them. This is kind of important when you're hiring for people. And you can scan them and then just make sure that you don't send sort of like settler or planner kind of people over to explore the West, because they're probably gonna be failing. Intuition is a very important word for chaotic, because seriously, you have nothing to begin with, so you just be going on gut instinct, gut feelings, as opposed to the institutionalized knowledge on the other end of the scale. And in terms of experience, this is what your experience will be like. And this is kind of interesting. I had to remove words from this, but there's way more. This is just me seeing it everywhere, just some examples. But here comes the more interesting one. I don't think the northwest or north-south thing is has such a high impact, but this east-west kind of thing is really crucial. And then we have the dynamic kind of scope in the west, and a more stable universe in the east. And then it begins, because then how you do research, you explore unknowns, right? And how you build things, you probably build on things you actually control. Anyone of you is working in R&D? Anyone has split mind about it? I mean, this is why. The split personality, totally different mindset for the same job. And then it goes, because then you have, what can you do if you have unknowns? You must be going all to just to control the risk and reduce them. So you have all these lean and agile kind of things coming in, as opposed to the planning kind of things that you can apply in the East. For this, you probably want to reduce. I mean, you want to plan for time units, and as opposed to units of delivery, what you can do in the East. And then for the unknowns and to eliminate the unknowns, you need to apply those plethora of methods in the design thinking toolset, all the means to build ideate, build prototypes, and then get validation from customers, as opposed to the planning approaches and system thinking. Retrospection will be very important in the West, and you can probably do a lot more planning ahead in the East. And then you'll see a lot of emergence, things you didn't expect, you didn't know you'd be getting in the West. But you'll be seeing a lot more recurrent patterns in the East. And you'll have a higher diversity versus a lot higher, more consistent landscape. And this is where architects are going to go at each other's throats. Because if you're used to living in the West, you'll be just building things that in 2 years' time, when things have changed again, you can just sort of replace with something new. as opposed to the Eastern kind of mindset that's more stable, and they go for reusable things. And these things, these are just little words. But if you throw it at some like systems or enterprise architect, they will fledge them out, and they'll have tens and methods and practices deriving from these. And this is why we have that variety. And so this is for planning, larger scale versus more sort of item-based things. And so this East-West thing, I think, drives a lot of conflict. And it's kind of really important, and it's kind of fun also to watch for. But yeah, there was a lot. So this is a short one. So if you just pass your team, probably some of you is like project or team lead, just pass your team. Just an advice, like just listen to what they say, what they shout. It's the only capitals in the slide. I don't know, I didn't read the code of conduct, if I can pronounce this. You all know what it stands for. So if you hear this, they're probably in the chaotic domain. If you did, you know what's this? It's shaking my head, right? So you see a lot of heads going back and front. They're probably sort of like going, what? If they're just getting shit done, stuff done, they're probably in the complicated. And if you hear them, this is the read, again, the manual. That just means they're in the domain where it's just really something down to be applied, institutionalized knowledge. So anyway, this was my fun part, but here let's move on to Codefin. What do we do in software development? We have collaboration. Now we work in teams. So if you are in the chaotic situation, it really is worthwhile to bring in a lot of input. So you have these more programming practices where basically the entire team collaborates on one piece of thing being built, and everyone contributes their best wisdom and know-how, as opposed to the complex, which is where you do make these small concerted experiments that's really good to have a buddy for, but maybe not the entire team, as opposed to the complicated, which is where you sit down and look at the books and say, oh, that's what we're going to do. Well, then do it. We look at it later. As opposed to writing man pages, like handbooks. Seriously, just do it. Now, interesting to note that most of the time we spend in software development, well, if the team and the product is functioning up in the north. In terms of methods, what we need in the chaotic domain, we have this method family spike and stabilize. It means you build a spike, which is a in my interpretation, it is a throwaway artifact. The crucial thing about the spike is that you don't build it for the sake of delivering, you build it for the sake of learning. You don't know what's out there, and you just try something out. If it works, you may keep parts of it, but ultimately it's a throwaway thing. That's why you stabilize, keep the bits in it. That worked out. The complex space will require prototypes. You'll be needing these experiments, these sort of small validations to figure out whether the technology or the user or the usability will work that way. For this, you'll probably be building prototypes. Some of them will be built on your technology stack, some on paper, but they'll have an iterative approach, as opposed to the incremental development. And I don't have time to go into the detail, into the differences between the two, but there's literature out there. The incremental would basically mean that you can understand what your access management module or audit module or user management or billing or fulfillment will have to do. So you can specify it, and you may just implement it as one unit. You don't need to do this sort of small slices and figuring out and experimenting and exploring. You can just do it. And then build increments on it. And then you will notice if you're in the obvious domain, because you'll be just burning out from processing Jira tickets. And again, most of the time, the projects will be spending time in the north. Same pattern. In terms of architecture, what we have is, what do we have in architecture terms in the chaotic domain? Well, we do have an architecture which just don't need it, don't see it. It's like you walking in like Mexico and you stumble over a stone and you go like, what? it's a stone. No, you dig a bit. No, wait, it's a wall. No, you dig more. Oh, it's a house. It's got a door and stuff. No, wait, that's a street. No, wait, there's a church out there. Whatever, pyramid, anything. It's a large thing, marketplace. So there's an architecture, but when you stumble on a stone, you just fall over. You don't know what's underneath. So you have to unearth it. Emergence is a very important term, and you will see a lot of that if you are in a complex domain, because by means of these small experiments, you'll be discovering what works and what not, and then you see what structures will work out for you, as opposed to, well, not opposed to, apologies, but like a different approach to the architecture is this evolutionary approach that you can follow if you can map things out ahead. Basically, you can map your module or your functionality out already beforehand, and then you'll be evolving it with the following iterations. And you do have an architecture in the obvious domain as well. It's just that so limiting that you don't notice it much as such. And again, the healthy times, the good times, the fun times, the interesting times are in the north. So in terms of design, what we have well, it was just my work slide, so I was thinking if I need something to design, how do I perceive it? This is how I perceive it. But more in terms of like categorically, basically you don't have much of a design to speak of in chaotic. It's just all over the place. And by means of finding the structures, you'll be extracting it, and then it begins to sort of emerge. And this refactoring is something that's super important for the complex domain, because as you are making your experiments and see what works, then you begin saying things like, oh, it begins to look like that thing we did elsewhere. Oh, let's make it look like that. So you'll be refactoring towards things that you see emerging, as opposed to in the complicated domain where you can see it up front. Well, you know, it's a hierarchy, it's a file system, so we use the composite pattern. There's 20 pages in a book, there's code samples, just do it. You have the pattern up front. And again, you do live in a pattern in the obvious domain, north and south. In terms of code, work slide, that was my take on it. But like in a more generic kind of sense, what it's about is that you do need a lot of flexibility when in chaotic, because you don't even know where you're going. So you need something that gives a lot of leg room, a lot of room to experiment and explore. Now, these things, it's not so much a developer conference, so I'm not really going into a lot of detail what's the difference between these kind of languages. But by and large, the dynamic and the weak typing languages, again, give you more room to maneuver. And the static languages give more institutionalized kind of control and sort of stability and framework and solid kind of like support on the edges. And what you have in the obvious domain, we do program a lot in the obvious, we just don't notice it as such. I mean, if you are working in the obvious domain, then someone somewhere probably have extracted the domain knowledge and probably have something like a DSL, like a domain-specific language, where they said, you know, yes, there's a lot to do, but seriously, you only need these 5 words. So just tell it in these terms of these 5 words. So someone has this domain language for you probably, or a tool where you just sort of click checkboxes, and then someone does the work for you and make it into actual code. Because it's so crystallized, it's so sort of well understood that it's reduced in scope. Hence, it's obvious for you. Not in the real world, but most of the time, again, you'll find yourself in the north. Now, testing practices are highly important, and they also often misunderstood, and there's a lot of vocabulary being misused there. But basically what it means is that if at all you write tests in the chaotic domain, you will be doing it at the end. Now, TDD is a term you probably have heard a lot if you have developers working, and most of the time they're saying it, they aren't doing it, but that's not a problem. Most of the time they say TDD, they actually mean test first, because they mean they've written their test first. That's not TDD. What TDD is not a testing practice, it's a design practice. TDD is by means of small additional slices of functionality, you discover what kind of design would be optimal, and once you see it, you refactor towards it, and hence you discover your actual design. It's not the same as having the design up front and just writing a test for it. There's nothing wrong with writing tests first. But most of the time when people be claiming doing TDD, they'll be actually doing a test first. It's no problem, but just so you understand the difference. And it doesn't so much matter when you're writing tests in the obvious domain. Main thing is that you're writing those in the first place. And so when we bring it together, this is what we get. And software engineering is a very complex domain. Well, there's a lot going on. Piles of books and hundreds of web pages. And like sometimes I think every single 3- and 4-letter library abbreviation is used for something. And there's a lot, and there's a reason for this multitude. And I think this is the reason for the multitude. That depending on the context, depending on the situation you're in, there's a different set of tools that comes best. And if you're choosing habitually, if you're making those non-decisions, then you're probably not going to have such a pleasant experience when you end up in a different domain than you're used to being. So it is actually super challenging, because not only have to be familiar with the tool set of one particular context, but also be capable of moving out and realizing, hey, we've just been bounced out of our convenient, cozy, whatever context we're used to. But we now probably better use different techniques. And we probably shouldn't be having such a strong, sort of almost like religious kind of arguments about this is the best and that's the best and why. And there's so many flame wars going on. Because it is. Because some people living in, like typically in the East, are perfectly fine with their tool set, and they're just raging about people who are living in the West and need and use different methods. And that's why they don't understand each other. And again, most of the time you'll find that the actual stable, the actual sustainable, the actual productive methods will be this sort of steady interplay, like move back and forth between complex and complicated. So what you do want to do is avoid drifting down, and it's not much of a question about you will notice when you'll be drifting down in the West, because then people start screaming, shouting, and something, I don't know, something really hard to solve will emerge, and people will not know how to deal with it. You will notice it if you're drifting down towards chaos. And then you can get some of those techniques further down in the Southwest. And then make those really short loops of figuring out how to get out of, how to move further back north to complex. Now, if you're drifting south in the East, that's actually harder to notice, because that's something like getting comfortable and just having something that works for you, which is kind of good in a sense, but then if you're doing things that are kind of obvious, then you're probably not going to have a job in like a few years, because the robots or somebody will be doing it. Machine learning, somebody. You don't want to, what's the added value? 0. So you don't want to get comfortable. If you notice you're drifting down, if you notice you're using too much of the obvious techniques, then look at it twice, because you probably want to discard them. You probably want to do something like, I don't know, sell that, like outsource the business unit. You don't need them. You just buy it in, buy a commodity software for it. But your focus should be towards the north. So this was where it was like kind of arcing back to the beginning of the story, but I was totally lost. And so from what I kind of like discovered on this journey for myself, that the next time I'm asking myself, I think that is the answer. Just head north. Thank you.